I'm going to be talking about the resource curse, or paradox of plenty, as it's sometimes called, and about how having an abundance of natural resources can prove to be a curse rather than a blessing for a developing country. I'll be talking mainly about Nigeria and its oil, but I'll refer to a number of other countries in passing. I'll also mention sovereign wealth funds, which put simply are long-term investment accounts for countries. Ladies and gentlemen, as the largest producer of oil in Africa, you might expect Nigeria to be the envy of the continent. You might expect its people not to be afflicted by poverty in the way so many of its African neighbours are. And you might hope that Nigeria could provide an example for other nations to follow in how to manage one's natural resources and make them work for the good of society as a whole. However, such hopes and expectations have largely gone unfulfilled. In fact, the Nigerian experience is a textbook example of what academics refer to as the resource curse, or paradox of plenty. What does this mean then? Well, this term was first used back in 1993, and it refers to the inability of nations with vast natural resources to use those resources to bolster their economies and thus improve their people's standard of living. Instead of bringing about the latter, those rich natural resources bring corruption and poverty to a nation, not positive economic development. And that's not all. Counterintuitively, these countries end up performing worse economically and socially than those without such abundant natural resources. Now, I don't know about you, but I had to do a double take when I learned that this was the case. As you might imagine, in a world increasingly concerned with development issues, this phenomenon has been the subject of extensive research, and Nigeria is often in the spotlight in that research. You might wonder why. Well, Nigeria is arguably the archetypal cursed nation. It's the largest oil producer in Africa, as I mentioned. It's the 6th largest global exporter of oil, and it holds the 10th largest proven oil reserve in the world. Thus, Nigerians ought legitimately to have been able to expect to reap the benefits of those abundant deposits. And yet Nigeria and other countries with similarly abundant resources display lower growth rates, lower levels of human development, and more inequality and poverty than those countries that are less endowed with natural resources. Again, a surprising fact, as I said before. Those countries have also been found to have weaker institutions and to be more conflict-riven than countries far poorer in resources. So why then does this happen? Why are Nigerians cursed rather than blessed? Well, in case you haven't already guessed, this paradox arises predominantly due to poor political governance and to weak institutions. This leaves the door open to corruption at all levels of society and the economy. The consequences of such corruption and mismanagement are dire. Oil exporting nations such as Nigeria, Venezuela, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have seen their economies devastated and many citizens' livelihoods destroyed. In recent years, I'm sure that we've all seen footage from Venezuela of impoverished citizens struggling to find supplies of food and other essentials in empty shops. And I literally mean people out there on the streets rummaging through bins in some cases for scraps of food with which to feed themselves and their families. And yet Venezuela has abundant oil reserves, which in theory ought to give citizens there a much higher standard of living than that registered in neighbouring South American countries. How can it all have gone so wrong for Venezuela, I hear you ask? I'm sure that many books and doctoral theses will be devoted to the resource curse in Venezuela in the future. Thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, it is not all gloom and doom. There have been numerous countries throughout history, such as Norway, Canada, and even examples from Africa, Botswana, who've resisted the curse through strong state management and with the help of institutions that remain largely free of corruption. Let me dwell on corruption for a while because it's crucial to understanding what is at stake. Corruption is the single greatest obstacle to economic and social development, significantly so in less developed countries. Worldwide, an estimated $2 trillion is siphoned away annually by corruption. A mind-boggling figure, if you ask me. It's certainly difficult for me to understand how much money we might be talking about there. But suffice it to say that such an amount could eradicate poverty, educate all the world's children, cure malaria, and bridge the global infrastructure gap. But instead, it gets squirreled away into overseas bank accounts, making a number of people stinking rich and doing nothing to alleviate the poverty of the general population. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not claiming that managing these windfall revenues is child's play. To absorb an influx of petrodollars, which the revenue from oil sales is counted in, is a complex issue for any nation. But it's an even bigger challenge for nations not known for the strength and integrity of their institutions. Countries with these windfalls struggle to responsibly process the currency which is generated. Often they initiate large infrastructure projects, building roads and bridges and dams, without the proper feasibility studies having first been carried out. Large sums of money get lavished on projects with dubious potential benefits. The approach basically seems to be that if there's plenty of money available, there's no need to spend it wisely. In other words, much of the new wealth gets wasted. Another risk factor is what is commonly referred to as the Dutch disease. This name was coined when non-hydrocarbon sectors were decimated in the Netherlands in the early 1960s. Let me sketch in a little bit of the background to this briefly. Studies have shown that following an oil boom and imbalanced results as the non-oil sectors in the countries concerned tend to be neglected. As demand for capital and labour rises, the booming oil sector sucks both of these out of other essential but less lucrative sectors, such as agriculture, leaving them severely weakened. In the case of the Netherlands, this state of affairs came about after substantial North Sea gas deposits were discovered in Dutch territorial waters in 1959. The massive energy exports that resulted caused the Dutch guilder to soar in value. Of course, back then there was no euro, and countries did not enjoy the currency stability that comes from being part of a larger currency area, like the euro area. This meant then that other sectors of the Dutch economy became far less competitive in nature and exports of non-energy products fell steeply. Furthermore, unemployment in the Netherlands in the early 60s rose from 1.1% to 5.1% as jobs in non-energy sectors disappeared. Over time, sensible countries have realised that the best way to avoid Dutch disease is not to bring all the revenue into the country at the same time. In this way, the rise in value of the local currency can be kept in check. So what happens then to the rest of the money? Well, it's placed in so-called sovereign wealth funds, which are essentially long-term investment accounts for countries, so that that money can be used by future generations. In this way, the money is not all spent at once. Let's not forget that fossil fuels are a finite resource and will one day run out, meaning that the revenue streams, like the flow of oil, will one day dry up. Norway has used such sovereign wealth funds, as have Alaska and the Canadian province of Alberta. In developing countries, however, the temptation to spend the lot can be too great to resist, to an extent that is understandable. Newfound wealth creates expectations by citizens, and demands for resources increase, not just from state bodies but also from civil society. And if I were Nigerian, I too would want to see money being spent. The middle class demands more social spending, unions demand higher wages for the same jobs, and the unemployed demand more social protection. Inevitably, what money is not siphoned off through corruption gets spent, and nothing is put away for a rainy day. However, as we have seen, with astute management and determination, some countries have beaten the resource curse and steered their economies to success. It's to be hoped that Nigeria can ultimately emulate Norway and not Venezuela. So far that has not happened, and corruption is rife. Nigeria has failed in much of its population's eyes. Whether Nigeria's resource curse can one day be transformed into a blessing, only time will tell. Thank you for your attention.